Hello, this is episode 44 of the For All That podcast, and today Andrew and I are joined by Christopher Silver, who is involved in making a documentary about the independence referendum and has made some other films along with colleague Jack Foster. How's it going, Christopher?
Great. It's nice to be on the podcast in such a lovely and somewhat rare sunny afternoon. I have a theory that ultimately a yes vote will be far more likely if we have more days like this. So it's nice to be inside, certainly.
There probably is some sort of sinister evidence for that actually if there are a number of bright sunny days, then that will lift the average optimism of the ordinary Scot and of course increase their chances of melanoma as they get their taps half in the sunshine. But on the plus side, that actually we could probably prove that through Freakonomics or something like that. That's a happy thought, isn't it, Michael?
Well, there is a website. I think when it goes above, it's taps on, and then like when it goes above 21 degrees, it changes to taps off. There is a website that does just exactly that.
It's one of our unique cultural practices.
Indeed. If we can come to Christopher, so how's it going with the film? I believe you've got a funding drive on at the moment, but could you keep us up to date with what's going on? What's happening with the film?
Yes, our funding drive is currently sitting on 87% with 15 hours to go, so it's tense. Obviously, we're raising this money, to allow us to cover the post-production costs and the distribution for the film. The film itself, I mean, obviously, I can't possibly reveal any intimate details about where it's at, but it's going very well. It's been all over the country, to the far north, to the extreme west, and speaking to some really interesting people. And I think that from Leslie Riddick to Jim Sillars to Cat Boyd, trying to get as broad a spread of the independence movement as possible and delve into those slightly more interesting areas that often tend to get neglected by broadcasters and the more conventional media. But ultimately, our main aim is to make a really good film. And I think we do have the makings of that. And I think the trailer that we put out last month does does demonstrate that, we've done it on a budget, but it's going to be a quality film nonetheless.
Isn't it really interesting, though, that the way in which people actually now are able to use all of these mediums and use their kind of training and their background and the know-how around these technologies to create really good quality material? It's not a dodgy YouTube clip of somebody's ant waggling or the kind of in a webcam. That they can be really high quality and really, be very positively distributed across the country using these social media techniques. I mean, I'm quite hostile to some of the social media bollocks. I think there's the kind of the priests cast of that who are much too obsessed about it. But on the other hand, there's something wonderfully, marvelously democratic about it, that it can really distribute the kind of thing that you're producing, Christopher, and really enable it such that, you can get 87% of your funding or whatever from folk with a shared endeavour. I think that's really, really positive. I think.
Yeah, and I think it does come out of, we're living in very interesting times, and if we weren't living in interesting times, then all of these crowdfunded projects, I simply don't think would be possible. I think there are sections of the commentariat that maybe like to focus on it as almost as a kind of human interest story, as if it doesn't have any link to the context of the referendum itself. But I think it's just the unique amount of focus and goodwill that you have sort of congregating around this referendum debate, particularly on the yes side, that does allow these things to happen, which would not have been possible 2 or 3 years ago.
Is there a case to be made that, in part, people also contribute to these because they don't feel that, I hate the overuse of the phrase the mainstream media, but is it in part because people feel that the mainstream media isn't doing its job properly, that they recourse to other means of trying to get certain stories out?
I think that yes, I think obviously there is that problem, and one of the things that I think is attractive about what we are doing to people is that it's a more productive way to vent that frustration. I think that ultimately people need to understand that, okay, protesting against the perceived bias of BBC Scotland is all very well, but in the amount of time that we have, given that we've got 100 days to go, I don't think that's going to have a particular impact on the referendum result. Whereas providing an alternative look at the referendum campaign, which comes at things from a different angle, which disregards really the party political contest, and actually that's the key thing about this film. Which, when it comes out, I hope it really provides a big talking point for people in the referendum, and we're going to be going around the country doing screenings in all over the place, and we want to be able to, hopefully start a conversation about the more interesting things that have happened to everybody in Scotland as a result of this referendum moment.
And what really appeals to me about it as well, this idea is as we've discussed in this podcast before, Michael, and as I think I've written about before as well on the blog, I get very tired of the kind of BBC bias story. I get very bored by it, and I find that it's very unproductive, as Christopher was saying there. It doesn't take us to anywhere positive. It's not really affirming in any particular way. It's just a kind of grouse, and it may be a well-founded grouse, and there are certainly good examples of things to be unhappy about. But I much prefer a more ebullient, positive, creative sort of thing that says, well, you're not doing this for me, you're not covering the kind of conversation that I want to see reflected, so I'm going to make my own space to do it. That really appeals to me so much more, because I think it takes us into a much more positive kind of domain, and I think that's where the Yes campaign has to be. I know it sounds, or can sound, a bit sort of Stephen Noon's vision of a very happy, hopey, changey, Obama-esque, to touch on an issue I know we're going to come to in a bit, Michael, but I think that's really the right way to approach it. It's really important to show these untold stories and to reflect the reality of this campaign as I experience it, and I know that hundreds of thousands of other people are experiencing it too. So I really like the positivity of it in a practical way.
At risk of blowing our own trumpets, isn't that what we've been doing for the last 2 years?
It's certainly an aspiration, I think, absolutely, and certainly you've had some rather wonderful people on your podcasts, Michael. I was listening recently to your Corinne Polwart podcast, and actually, that's quite a big deal. She's a very talented, very smart woman, and maybe, not everyone's going to like their Scottish contemporary folk music, and fair enough, but I do. I've been to one of her concerts, and I think that's kind of rather exciting, and I think you're right, that fosters a kind of different sort of conversation, and one which is, that's wrong, I'm wrong about that. It doesn't foster a different kind of conversation. It simply reflects in a kind of public, lasting way the kind of conversations which, if you open your ears, you hear all the time, all over the streets of Scotland, and I think that's a really good thing. And we can be proud of ourselves slightly too, Michael. More you than me. I'm just a kind of shifty tag along, to be honest.
I'm just clever with the program. Right. I'm just clever with the editing program Audacity. That's the only thing. But Christopher, is there a release date for the film yet?
Yes, there is. That's going to be confirmed imminently. By which I mean,
I was going for the exclusive.
Well, you're unfortunately just merely a few hours away from the exclusive, but we hope to announce that tomorrow. And also then, after we've announced the release date, by the middle of this month, announce a series of screenings which will happen for free all over the country.
So just you said that there's 15 hours to go on the Indiegogo. What's it finish at 12 o'clock tomorrow?
It finishes early tomorrow morning, because the crowdfunding platform is on Pacific time, annoyingly, but that's just one of the odd things you have to deal with when you're funding your film this way.
So where should people go to get it?
To the crowdfunder?
Yeah.
Well, if they follow us on Twitter at Scotland Yet, we, all one word, we will be tweeting about it furiously for more information on the film. Also look at www.scotlandyet.com.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And now, here's a bit of a stretched segue, but we'll go for it. Today is World Oceans Day, which I know Andrew loves that sort of thing. And we'll take a hop across the ocean, because Obama decided to intervene, or was asked to intervene, and then the BBC was also involved in his intervention. It's a growing story. Is Obama going to change the way you vote? I'll go to Andrew first there.
Well, I think nobody can change the way I can vote. I'm one of those committed cybernats that was likely to vote yes, come hell or high water. But I don't honestly think that his intervention is likely to change a great deal for a couple of reasons. One is, well, who is Obama these days? What kind of figure is he in the mind of the ordinary Scot? If we look at his politics, he's probably to the right of David Cameron politically, ideologically. But let's just bracket that. For a period of time, he was a more uplifting sort of figure, a post-Bush figure, hostile to the war in Iraq, wanting a kind of change of politics, pledging to close Guantanamo Bay. Some of that has been achieved. Guantanamo Bay remains open, it must be said. And I think he's been tarnished by a series of accommodations and the fact that in American political terms, the president has relatively limited power. You know, it's something which all people with a kind of proper sense of history and society should recognize, that change isn't really driven from the top by the great men of history. Hegel was wrong, as your old pal Marx said some time ago. So it's probably wrong to project all of these aspirations onto Barack Obama, but they were projected. But that's no longer the case. If he'd stood up, say, I don't know, five years ago, say if Alexander had taken Wendy Alexander's challenge to heart and had brought it on at that point, and if Barack Obama had stood up in Airdrie and had said, you know, the people of the Western world must not be divided, the people of Scotland, I call upon you in the name of liberty, truth and justice to stay in solidarity with your fellow members of the Union. If he'd done that, then we'd be having a very different conversation from his intervention this week, which was halting, inarticulate, rather vague and imprecise, and he didn't, watching him, he didn't appear terribly well prepared for it. It may have been a prepared line, he may have been invited to make it by David Cameron. In fact, if I was David Cameron, I'm sure I'd badger Barack Obama to endorse the Union. But for me, the Barack Obama of today, in the terms of his intervention, is not a game changer in the way in which Better Together were trying to represent it the other day.
And Christopher, what did you think about Obama's comments?
Not much really, and again, that's obviously to do with the nature of them, the fact that they were clearly stage managed and inarticulate. But I think that what is interesting about them is it's not so much the remarks themselves or even the fact that they happened. It's the way that they were instantly seized upon with lightning speed, with a sort of suspiciously quickly drafted and printed leaflets with his image, the iconic image of Nope and so on underneath them. And I think that what that actually says is a kind of, it says something far more damaging about the No campaign, I think, in that they look for endorsements. And if you look, for example, you see this with it's happened with cultural figures, and they don't look for somebody like David Bowie, for example, to actually participate in the debate. They look for them to comment as a celebrity from a distance. And I think that completely misunderstands and ignores the actual grassroots nature of what is happening with the campaign, and it kind of rests on a kind of top-down politics, which I think, hopefully, lots of people in Scotland are kind of moving beyond. Whether they're yes or no, they're sort of realising that this moment in Scotland's political history is about the conversations that they're having, not things that they're being told by powerful people elsewhere.
Well, Michael, what do you think about it? Because I imagine that Barack Obama is potentially a somewhat problematic figure for you with your well-known enthusiastic attitude to Atlanticism. I was getting a taxi back the other day, and my taxi driver was inclined, I think I'd describe him as, he'd describe himself as, but his explanation for his indecision and what might move him was expletive deleted, getting us out from under the Americans was his view. So I do feel there are some people in Scotland who this might not have gone down terribly well with. Are you one of them, Michael?
Yeah, I think it's complicated because what we currently have is an idea that we're going to join in NATO. So that's not exactly getting us out from under the feet of the Americans. But
No.
But at the same time, in Britain, we are completely under the feet of the Americans. And if Scotland is a smaller army, then there's not so much tactical advantage in America pressuring Scotland to join in when it's next thing. And that was the interesting thing I thought about Obama's comments as well, because there's always a quid pro quo. why did he make that comment? What was he getting in return for that? I can't imagine it was just as a favour to David Cameron. Now, someone suggested today that the reason he was making these comments is that suddenly I believe there was a British ship sent off somewhere towards Russia. I can't believe he was saying it just for the hell of saying it, and because he really has any strong commitment towards the Union of the United Kingdom. Is partly what he said about he wants a strong ally. What does he want that ally for? For the projection of the American empire around the world. Noam Chomsky once commented that an American official once said that Britain's new role is as America's attack dog because they can't be seen to be projecting this military power so directly. So they need someone to back them up, and then they can make this myth of the international community. Well, if that's how they want to define the international community, I'm quite happy for us to be out of it, like your taxi driver friend said. But I agree with what you said earlier as well, that Obama is a tainted figure now. I mean, with the drone strikes that are going on, targeted assassinations, I mean, he's not this liberal hope figure anymore that many people believed him to be.
And is that often one of these things which is quite overestimated? I remember we discussed probably months, maybe even years ago now in this podcast, about Obama when he was re-elected, about whether we misconstrue American politics and our politics. And I think, personally, I found that quite persuasive. I once got my father The Audacity of Hope, I think it was, or The Audacity of Nope, as we should think about it now, I suppose. My father read it and was increasingly dismayed by the vision of politics which Barack Obama articulated in terms of its conservatism on things like the death penalty, and at that stage, gay marriage, for example. Barack Obama was not behind that. I think we misconstrue him, and therefore, in the sense, even if we do afford him a sort of moral status, it's probably misplaced. As Christopher was saying, I think the idea that we should follow what great men say to us is a very problematic one in a democratic politics, and one can but hope that people won't really take that on board one way or the other, because it's a question for us. There's another point which I made about this too, which is that the relevance of Barack Obama's comments maybe depend on what are the key salient issues for us in this referendum. So if we talk a lot about domestic policy, about taxation, about welfare, about those kinds of choices, about education, say, then Barack Obama's comments aren't particularly relevant. If we, however, pan out from our map and think about Scotland as a geopolitical entity in a wider set of conflicts and challenges, defence, security, those kinds of things, then maybe his remarks take on more salience. It seems to me that mostly the Yes campaign is dominated by arguments on the domestic front, with rather less to say about international things beyond a general idea that things like the Iraq War were a problem and maybe we'd want more ability to block our participation in them. I don't know, Christopher, what do you think about that? Am I right in my diagnosis, or am I missing a trick?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I've actually thought for some time that there would be within the debate more a turn towards international matters around about this stage. I think, well, particularly when you have the Commonwealth Games in July, you have the Armed Forces Day in Stirling, I think, at the end of June, and you have, of course, the World War One commemorations. These are all things which have a strong kind of resonance when it comes to Scotland's place in the world, both historically and in terms of how it sees itself today. And I think that though the Barack Obama intervention might be seen to sort of be kickstarting some kind of new form of unionism, which is seen to be backed by other countries or the leaders of other countries, I think that this, from the point of view of Yes, is a big advantage, because it allows Yes campaigners to talk in great depth about one of the biggest issues, the most obvious issues about the campaign, which is Trident, really. And I think that the closer that you get to any kind of territory which allows you to talk about that particular issue, I think that's probably a good thing in terms of moving this along. So, I think things will become more focused on Scotland's place in the world, but I don't think that'll necessarily work for the no vote. For those reasons.
No, because there's still a lot of residual anger about Britain's role in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think people in Scotland generally react against the kind of flag waving and the kind of thing that Gordon Brown started to sort of say, that we shouldn't apologise for the empire, we should be proud of it, and this kind of thing. And I think that that might play a bit differently with people in England than it does with people in Scotland. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, because it's a problematic inheritance, isn't it? And if all you have to do is wander through the middle of the centre of Glasgow to see the wages of empire writ and carved in stone and great wealth and things like that. But on the other hand, that many Scots would feel quite alienated from that version of history, and particularly the one that you just mentioned, the idea that we should somehow rejoice in the fact that we gave India the railways, and therefore that justified almost anything that one did in terms of asset stripping abroad.
Can I just interject on that? Because the reason we gave India the railways was to speed up the process of funneling money out of India and taking it back to Britain. I mean, no, that's the truth of the matter, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I take your word for it in that context. But certainly I think that you're right that it's a more problematic inheritance in Scotland. And in one way, it really doesn't matter whether or not it should be or not. If people don't feel strong affinities towards empire, then in the sense if they react against this sort of idea of a Britishness which intervenes abroad, which to some extent uses the imagery of D-Day and that symbolism to justify contemporary military interventions, if you react to that, then that's quite a powerful reason, I think, to vote yes, because that kind of British mania for intervention and seeing itself as a global player is something which is not solvable within the British state for us, for our children, for the people who live here. And therefore, it's one of the strongest arguments to vote yes. I mean, even if you're like me and could potentially be persuaded by a kind of Devo Max argument, it comes back to fairly simple points, which is, well, how do you feel about foreign affairs? And how do you feel about defence? And therein, I think, is one of the weaker arguments for the Union.
Yeah, I think this is all covered very well in the James Foley's book, The Radical Case for Scottish Independence. It is actually, we often think of the anti-imperialist dimension as being as a kind of added extra. You can get a more socially just society, or you can get a fairer society, and on top of that, people perceive you as being a bit less nasty than the Brits. But I think actually it's probably something that's actually much more fundamental than that, and certainly their book starts from that point and sort of says actually and actually it's very interesting the way that the links that you see within the Yes movement to previous protest movements, particularly against Iraq, but it does go even further back than that. It goes back to the anti-nuclear movement, and that inheritance, is what has taken us, right up to this point, and it's it's all the way through the Yes campaign, and I think that for that reason, certainly the kind of things that Yes campaigners would be talking about that relate to the wider world, they are going to be more progressive. Of course, the big challenge in September is finding out whether that's a message that can get through to a majority of the Scottish people. That's something we don't know, But what's exciting about it, is the opportunity to maybe sort of, express some kind of alternative to the thing which, is as dominant as the ghost of Thatcher, is the ghost of Bush and Blair.
Yeah. Yes, Scotland should be having Tony Blair on every poster possible. He's just not a popular man in Scotland. I always loved the joke about an anagram of Tony Blair PM is I'm Tory Plan B. I always thought that was a good one. But yeah, if we can move on a bit, because another thing that's been talked about quite a lot today is the apparent fact that if Scotland goes independent, the world will not find a cure for cancer, which seems to me an extremely bizarre state of affairs. I think I'll go to Christopher first with that. What do you think of this story?
Oh, thanks. I don't really have an opinion on either on how well a cure for cancer is progressing, or what role the structure of the union plays in that. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I decline to comment any further on
that.
Andrew?
There we are. Well, yes, it's a sort of remarkable story, and it seems to be based on a Nobel Prize winner of one sort or the other. And he's really talking about research funding and cooperation and these kind of things. And you'd have thought that, well, the cure for cancer, from at least from my scientist friends, is a fantasy, that cancer is not a kind of unitary phenomenon and therefore should not be thought about in those terms. But nevertheless, the Sunday Express today are telling us that if we vote yes, we are to sort of adapt Orwell objectively pro-cancer, which is quite an interesting thought for those of us that vote yes. I mean, these kind of things just get totally hysterical. I mean, one of my consistent themes in this debate is we really have to be moderately more empathetic with each other, and that kind of allegation to be thrown across the gap between the yes and no's is just demented. But then it is the Daily Express, so what the hell did we think it would publish?
But then, because the no campaign's getting increasingly surreal, I'll take the yes campaign in a more surreal direction, because aliens could have the cure for cancer, and this is also a problem. I've just realised the logic's flawed, because wasn't one of the other rather bizarre statements from the no side that Scotland would be at danger from an alien attack? I'm sure there was something about that as well. So we can't even count on the aliens.
Exactly. Well, that anal probing might cure cancer. Yeah, you never know. If you just do it enough times, it might deliver us all. Yes, I mean, these things, it's been interesting over the past wee while. We've not been on air for a wee bit, but you've seen after a moment's panic, about a month ago, wasn't it, that the Unionists were getting deeply disturbed by a closening in the polls, and they seem to have regained their poise to some extent. But the story remains much the same, that there is a sort of dark tales of disaster and alienation and defeat and financial loss and all those kinds of things. So in the sense, actually, in the last sort of 100 days of this campaign, which is disturbingly where we're going now, how it has sped by, the battle lines are pretty well formed. One of the things which is very interesting, though, is because we've just had the regulated period, so the period covered by the legislation governing spending caps, that the SNP have this vast war chest, as we are statutorily obliged to describe it, waiting in the wings. What are they going to do with it? Yes, Scotland have rather a lot of money from the Weirs and other people, smaller contributors. One of my favourite stats is that in 2011, all of the Holyrood parties combined, everybody who stood for the Scottish Parliament, spent 2.6 million in total on the campaign. In this campaign, we have spending totals of Yes Scotland of 1.5 million. Which is, more than half of the total spent by all of the parties in Holyrood. This is going to be one of the most money-soaked campaigns that Scotland has ever seen. The most money-soaked campaign that Scotland has ever seen. And I don't think we've yet really detected from the SNP in particular what the hell they're going to do with their 1.3 million.
What would you suggest they do?
To be honest, I don't know. Well, of course, we know they can't do cinema ads because they've been banned now, because the ordinary punter doesn't mind watching a woman crouched in a Maserati to convince you that you ought to buy it, but does object to mild exposure to political beliefs in the context of their films. I think the public is a contemptible body of people. I'm not sure. I don't know where you spend that money on, to be honest. One of the things you can do to avoid campaign regulations is to spend it on salaries. So you could acquire a vast legion of little helpers, imps and sprites to do your bidding, but I'm not sure really what the SNP will do with it, because there are only so many leaflets that one can deliver. I mean, Michael, you're not an SNP man, but I don't know what you would suggest to turn your question back at you.
Well, I mean, the standard things would be billboards, television adverts, party politicals that nobody watches and nobody likes. Like you said, leafleting campaigns. The thing is about the Yes campaign, it is true that a lot of it sort of runs itself. It's local groups, and then you've got Radical Indie, you've got National Collective, and a lot of these things run themselves. So it'd be interesting, with all that money, are they allowed to support these other groups, or would they like to start another one? And then if you've got too many, does it just become confusing? It's quite interesting.
I mean, I just to interject there, if I could, I think it's really interesting the Vote No Borders thing, of course, is it's a great example of how money can't buy you a proper campaign, and actually it's remarkable given the the amount of money that particular organisation started off with, or claimed to have started off with, just how awful their output was. I mean, it's like if you go on, I mean, it's actually, what they've done is they've provided a website which is just full of extremely entertaining content for Yes supporters. Just to sort of like, if you want an evening's entertainment, go out, read some of the poems. Look at some of the songwriting that's coming out of that hotbed of creativity, and it's interesting, really. I think you look at National Collective now with their Yestival, they're doing that on, they raised £30,000. You compare that to the millions that are, as Andrew said, will be sloshing about now in this official campaign period, and you think, well, what difference will all of that money make? Maybe it'll actually be incidental, because I think that really the questions and the debate, it's become so pervasive that you can't avoid it now. I mean, you go into a pub, people talk about independence, and so it's really just sort of, how do you manage the quality of those conversations? And I'm not sure, and especially as well because it's not a general election, and therefore you can't target money at specific. You can target money at specific demographics, but you can't target money at marginal seats as you would in a normal election. So I mean, I'm not sure what effect all of that spending will have.
No, it's a good point, that, and it is one of these kind of challenges of this referendum campaign, that, as you say, you can't target it in that way, and it's everybody in every single pub. It raises a good point too about independence polling. We've seen so much polling going through in terms of the media, in terms of folk like Wings Over Scotland doing polls, but I still remain unconvinced that we really know what an accurate Scottish independence poll looks like yet. When you think about political polls that we do in terms of general elections, by-elections, Holyrood elections, they're based on certain observable phenomena. So, for example, in terms of the European elections, you can say, well, the SNP last time got X many votes. They're sort of quite popular, therefore to get Y many votes in this kind of poll. Notably, they managed to cock that up in the last European election. But they're based on observable phenomena about political allegiances, past voting behaviour, what newspapers you read. We don't have any of that data with respect to the independence referendum, where turnout is likely to be at least 10%, if not 20% higher than your ordinary general election, where you get about 60% of the population voting, and potentially could be much higher among rather unexpected parts of the electorate. I mean, all of this polling that we're getting done is based on these assumptions, and those assumptions could be wildly off. And if the assumptions are wildly off, then the poll is not worth the pennies that have gone to pay for it. So it may be that we're only on top of what a good independence poll looks like come the 19th of September, when we three have happy smiley faces unexpectedly, or expectedly, depending on how optimistic you are, or if we lose, then we'll know rather better where opinion sits. And I think that's kind of another one of these wild card things that we can talk about the polls narrowing or diverging, but I still don't think that even John Curtis, beloved Professor John Curtis, knows what a good independence poll is yet.
In many ways we're in a kind of uncharted territory, and it's a campaign like no other that we've seen. But I suppose if you take a step back, that was always likely to be the case. But I'd just like to get back to the more important point, which is aliens again. And that's it's completely irrelevant to everything else, but it's something that's always bothered me, and I think we should have a serious discussion on this matter. Mm-hmm. Like many of these people that say they've been abducted, and the aliens have performed some kind of cavity search, is the standard story. And what I've never understood is what these hyper-intelligent beings that are obviously hyper-intelligent in the fact that they've managed to come here, what would they learn from the 1,000,001st arse that they hadn't learned from the previous million? I've just never understood this. It constantly bothers me. And I actually tweeted that story, and I got the best answer I think I've ever had. Someone replied, "Michael, you've misunderstood the situation completely. They're looking for a specific arse." And speaking of a specific arse, did you see the comments that Alistair Darling maybe did or didn't say about blood and soil? Now there's a good segue. I'll go to Andrew first. Did he say it? Did he not say it? What do you think about this?
Inaudible mumble.
Ah.
That's my response. Yes. Well, I mean, we know for a dead cert that he said that for Alex Salmond to suggest that the BBC had excessively covered UKIP in the European elections was Kim Jong-il behaviour. I dare say there are plenty of oppressed Northern Koreans that might take some exception to the idea that the oppressions of the erstwhile beloved, was he dear great leader, something of North Korea amounted to that. On Blood and Soil, as you said, Alistair Darling said that he didn't say it. He was asked, it was one of those classic press questions where the journalist asks you a question, and then if you say yes, then they apply those words to you. But I think it does reflect a general point, which is that many folk in the Labour Party and otherwise would dearly like the SNP to be racist. And I'm really sorry to say that, but I think that's just empirically the case, that there's a strong... It would be much more convenient for them if their opponents matched up to their low opinion of them. And, you know, the SNP don't. I went just last weekend to the Pakistani welfare dinner in Glasgow, a wonderfully bizarre experience with the Athol Pipe Band and a range of sort of second and third generation Pakistani Scots, including the First Minister. He was there. Joanne Lamont was there. In fact, a vast array of politicians were there, and putting in an appearance and lobbying hard and being very politic and glad-handing and so forth. On one level, it was quite nakedly cynical. On the other hand, it was very uplifting in some ways, because you think, well, you have a nationalist First Minister of Scotland who unselfconsciously stands up in the Pakistan welfare dinner in a hotel in Renfrew and feels entirely at home and talks about the perils of a kind of UKIP-y approach to immigration and to hate crime in relation to the Muslim community of Scotland. And I thought it was a really uplifting, rather positive kind of thing, a rather surreal thing, but an uplifting, rather positive thing. So yes, those are my thoughts on the Blood and Soil. It so isn't true. It's such a scandalous allegation. It's such a false projection that it's one of the few things which actually makes my blood boil in this independence debate. And I'm a serene little character, as you know, Michael. So that's my thoughts on it.
Christopher?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Andrews has said there, but I think that what is perhaps more interesting about it is that, you know, maybe the Yes campaign can actually take comfort in a sense that the leader of Better Together is coming out with these kind of remarks at this stage in the game. You know, it's something which ultimately, you know, if you want to win something, the first step in winning something is to try and understand who your enemy is, and I think that a large part of the reason for the massive implosion of Scottish Labour as an organisation is just a flat-out refusal to look at the SNP or supporters from any party of Scottish independence in any kind of rational light. You know, and ultimately, I'm not suggesting that this is a game plan on their part, but nonetheless, it's ultimately just about sort of destroying the terrain on which a healthy argument can take place. You know, as we know, if the conversation isn't taking place, then that is to the benefit of the people defending the status quo. And I think that really what this remark is about is it's simply about just making the whole idea of independence and the referendum something that is difficult and divisive and about separating out different sets of people. And of course, the great irony is, well, you know, there are far more people defending the union who actually use the kind of blood and soil rhetoric that Alistair Darling was claiming for the SNP. And yet, of course, the irony is, at every party conference, Ed Miliband stands up in front of a massive Union Jack with the words "One Nation" written over the top of it, and at the risk of invoking Godwin's law again, we all knew, you know, there were other people. There have been other people throughout history who have used the tagline "One Nation," but let's not go into that again.
No, it's interesting. If you look at the overall kind of strategy, there seems to be actually two tracks to Better Together. There's the kind of more sort of informed, even though it's not informed, stuff like with the Blood and Soil, things that Alistair Darling might say. And then what we've already discussed today, we've had like the Scottish independence will stop cancer being cured. Apparently there was a story about the price of fish and chips will go up. And I mean, do you think, I mean, this is a strong question, but I've been moving this way more and more. Do you think that actually a lot of the campaigning strategy of Better Together shows almost a contempt for the people that they're trying to convince, that this is how stupid they think you are, that kind of thing?
Well, you mentioned the fish and chips. That was the rather lovely story about Lego scenes, which are rather creative. I rather enjoyed them being used to demonstrate what you could do with your union dividend. So it wasn't that fish and chips would cost more; it's that you could stuff yourself with, I think, 10 weeks a year with fish and chips. That didn't say so much what you could do if you favoured sausage supper, black pudding supper. No evidence there about what the UK would do for you on that front. But yeah, even Fraser Nelson, who edits The Spectator, thought that insulted the intelligence of the Scottish electorate, and you couldn't find a more inveterate unionist out there than Fraser Nelson. These are not good arguments. These are not uplifting arguments, and they're not lucid arguments either. I think that's one of the things which is almost unavoidable in this debate, that whether or not you think it's right that Scotland should be independent or not, the case for the union that we've seen and heard from Better Together, from the British government, has not been a lucid affirmation of one nation, which feels, at home with a clear sense of its moral vocation and purpose. We haven't had that case of Britain articulated. And I'm not their target audience, but I think I'm not being unfair to say that they've not achieved that kind of eloquence. And that in itself is somewhat disturbing, I should have thought, for the British state, even if it is able to survive after September.
If I could jump in there, yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Fraser Nelson, and I think that there's something quite telling about the fact that the pro-union commentators who seem to get what is going on tend to be positioned more on the right. You Fraser Nelson, I mean Alex Massey, and other writers in The Spectator. They come at it from a pro-UK point of view, but they tend to understand that there are big problems with the way that the union is being defended, and I think that that's just partly to do with the fact that it makes sense to support the union if you come to it from a right of centre perspective. Like and if you look at the language that Better Together use, the language of strength, and the focus on the pound, and the focus on continuity and security, like these are all matters which are generally favoured by those in the right, whereas the things which are already devolved to Scotland, tend to be things actually which the right is more interested in privatising, that the right thinks should have a very limited role in government anyway. And what is interesting is you have this, because Scottish Labour is so prominent in the debate, they lose the ability, they lose their compass entirely, because they know, I think they probably do really know, that yes, there is a coherent and rational case for the union, but it's not a progressive one.
I think that's a good point to wrap up for today, but just so we're on the subject of progressive people, and we've been talking about a quote from a famous American today, here's a progressive person that went to America. Thomas Paine died today in 1809, and a little quote from him: "We fight not to enslave, but to set a country free, and to make room upon the earth for honest men to live in." There you go.
There you go. He has a range of wonderful quotes, actually, from his works about that which we gain too cheaply, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness alone that gives all things their value. He also has a rather good things to say about honours and the stupidity and folly and childishness of making lords and barons and knights and so forth. A grand Englishman that's an inspiration to us all.
Yeah, and there's the famous one with the royals as well. A hereditary ruler is as absurd as the idea of a hereditary mathematician, which I've always quite liked. Or aristocracy is kept up by family tyranny and injustice. Thomas Paine was quite an interesting character in history. I'm not quite sure if he would have got on with Obama, though.
That's one for the historians, I think, Michael.
Okay, so thanks to Christopher for coming on, and I wish the film every success.
Thanks very much.
And Andrew, I'll speak to you next time.
Absolutely, I'll see you later.
And
Michael.
your dog made an appearance this week, not mine.
You heard them, all these strange schnauzer sounding through these little monsters.
Well, it's of a bold reporter, a story I will tell. He went down to the Cuban land, the nearest place to hell. He'd been there many times before, but now the law does say the only way to Cuba is with the CIA. William Worthy isn't worthy to enter our door. Went down to Cuba, he's not American anymore. But somehow it is strange to hear the State Department say you are living in the free world you must stay. $5,000 or a 5-year sentence may well be for a man who had the nerve to think that traveling is free. Oh, why'd he waste his time to see a dictator's reign when he could have seen democracy by traveling on to Spain? William Worthy isn't worthy to enter our door. Went down to Cuba, he's not American anymore. But somehow it is strange to hear the State Department say you are living in the free world you must stay. So come all you good travelers and fellow travelers too.